From the Times and the Sunday Times, this is The Story. I'm Manveen Rana. Deep in the Indian Ocean lies a cluster of little paradise islands that wouldn't look amiss in a James Bond film.
Imagine those kind of tropical islands from Robinson Crusoe or Treasure Island, sand, coconut, azure seas and palm trees and all the rest of it. That is it. And if you think of the Indian Ocean as kind of bounded by India, Africa and Australia, it's almost slap bang in the middle. It is as remote as you can get. It's a total paradise. You have these massive coconut crabs, I think, which are the largest arthropods. There are also wild donkeys running around the island. And then there's a kind of weird Anglo-American culture where they drive on the left, but then the cars seem to have American number plates. Some of the food is, grits and stuff like that. But then there's also Churchill Avenue and Britannia Way and all these kind of very British names. So it's a weird place by the sounds of it.
Have you been?
I have not been. I'd love to go. Unfortunately, journalists aren't really allowed to go. There's only a handful of occasions when they have been allowed because the US naval base that is there is top secret, basically. And they are very resistant to any outside coverage of it. And so we only have a kind of an inkling of what really goes on there.
What does go on these tropical islands with a top-secret US military base? And why are they now at the centre of a diplomatic row between London and Washington that could jeopardise the burgeoning relations between Trump and Starmer? The story today, the Chagos Islands, the spat that could threaten the special relationship.
Hello, my name is George Grylls. I am defence correspondent for The Times.
George, until recently, most people probably hadn't heard of the Chagos Islands, and suddenly it's really high up on the news agenda. It's become a political football. It's a real problem in UK-US relations. What is going on? Why is it suddenly hitting the news?
So the Chagos archipelago is in the middle of the Indian Ocean. It's a British overseas territory in a very strategic position in an increasingly competitive part of the world. And the US operates a military base on these islands, and the UK, under this government, is proposing to cede sovereignty of these islands to Mauritius, and this is causing a bit of a diplomatic headache.
So, in order to understand all of this, let's take a step back. Just tell us a bit about these islands.
There's around 60 islands spread across 7 atolls, of which the main one is called Diego Garcia. It's named after a kind of Portuguese explorer, which gives you a sense of how lots of different competing European powers were passing through there during the Age of Empire. And it's very hard to get to. You can only really get there by military aircraft now. It is spread out, so one atoll can be a day and a half sailing from another one. So it's all remote from one another as well as remote from the rest of the world. And it is incredibly strategic, basically, because it's in the middle of the Indian Ocean, through which 40% of world trade passes. And Britain acquired it during the 19th century at a time when Britain was kind of battling for control of the seas and those trade routes with France. And at the moment, now the 2 major world powers are the US and China. And so once again, the Chagos archipelago is part of that battle for control of the Indian Ocean.
one of the reasons the Chagos Islands are known, one of their big uses is this big US military base. Just tell us a bit about that.
So the US was scouring around in the 1960s for a really strategic location in the Indian Ocean through which they could kind of control everyone passing through there. And they decided on these islands. One reason is that it's outside the kind of cyclone belt, so it doesn't get affected by cyclones so much. It's also surrounded by a very deep trench. So, for example, if you remember the Boxing Day tsunami in 2004, I think it was.
Yeah.
The Chagos archipelago wasn't so much affected by it because the trench absorbs the waves that come from earthquakes. So it's actually quite protected. It's quite remote, so people can't really tell what you're up to. And the US has used that to develop this incredibly important military base where they have, for example, runways that can house nuclear-capable B-52 and B-2 bombers. They have what's believed to be a kind of submarine facility where they can reload torpedoes onto US submarines. There are a few locations in the world where you can do that. And then there's also what's thought to be a kind of basically a spying hub where they can listen in on communications around the world and around Asia.
So this is a geographically really strategic place. It's brilliant for the American military. It's brilliant for our military. Give us a bit of the history. How have we ended up being able to have any kind of control over it?
It goes back to when Britain was the world's major naval power and was sort of battling with France for control of the Indian Ocean and those trade routes to India in particular. And during the Napoleonic Wars, Britain kind of slowly won that battle, really, and kind of took all these islands back from France. And at the time, the Chagos archipelago was the middle of nowhere, the back beyond, not very important. But Mauritius, which is another country in the Indian Ocean, was part of France. Britain took control of it as part of the Treaty of Paris in 1814, I think it was. And the Chagos archipelago came under British control and remained so until Mauritius was awarded its independence in 1968 as part of decolonisation. And
yet since then, we still seem to have a say in what happens in the Chagos Islands.
Yeah, so the Chagos archipelago, from the outset, it has to be said, has not much in common with Mauritius. So it's actually closer to the Maldives. I mean, this is all relative. They're all hundreds, if not thousands of miles away from one another. So I think Chagos Islands are about 1,300 miles from Port Louis, which is the capital of Mauritius. They never had anything to do with one another before the British Empire. So it was basically British colonial administrators in Whitehall who decided, well, it doesn't make sense to have one person running this place in the middle of nowhere. We'll just group it together with Mauritius. So they were the ones who actually grouped it together. And this was the kind of core argument why Mauritius says, well, it's due back to us.
And what happened to the people who originally lived there when all of these colonial powers were passing the islands back and forth?
The people who were there, the Chagosians, were descendants really of African slaves who were brought over to work on coconut plantations there by the French, and they kind of speak a Creole. The Chagosians have suffered appallingly at the hands of not just the UK, but several countries. So in the 1960s, when the US identified Chagos as the place where they would like to have a base, the Brits said yes. And they wanted to get a discount on nuclear-carrying missiles that could be fired from submarines, Polaris missiles. And so the deal was they would acquire these US missiles on the cheap, and the US would get use of these islands for 50 years, and then they could extend it. And they didn't care what would happen to the Chagosians.
I was born on Peros Banos. I've been living there up to 1968, and I've never been able to return back. I've been able to return 32 years after, when I started legal procedure against the British government.
And if you look back at the records from the time, some astonishingly racist things were said by Foreign Office officials where they sort of described the Chagosians as a few Tarzans in one comment.
A few Tarzans.
A few Tarzans. They said there was nothing there except a few seagulls. The natives could basically be discounted.
It really was a different era.
It was a different era. And then what they did to the Chagosians was pretty brutal. You know, they basically tried to cut off their food supplies to kind of push them out, force them out. They started executing their pets. It's really horrible stuff.
How could they decided to uproot people from their very beautiful life and just to let this place abandoned. I just want to know.
And the Chagosians were then expelled and cast to the four corners of the earth, but mostly they ended up in Mauritius, the Seychelles, and the UK.
And for some years now, they've been fighting through the British courts to try and redress the situation. Tell us a bit about that.
It's worth clarifying at this point, what the Chagosians want and what the Mauritians want are separate things. So some Chagosians ended up in Mauritius, and actually they kind of suffered a lot of racist discrimination there. Mauritius is a country with, a lot of people there can trace their roots back to India. A lot of the Chagosians are of African descent. It wasn't the end of their struggles, basically, when they got to Mauritius. And then others went to the Seychelles and others went to the UK. So you can't speak for an entire community. There are about 1,500 people who were evicted in the 1960s and early 1970s. And some people would like the right of return to go back.
If we were white people with blue eyes, maybe we will have better treatment. We are not asking more. We are not asking less. We are asking our right as human beings. Thank you, my brothers and sisters.
Some people, a lot of them would just like to be able to visit on occasion to kind of see where they came from, because you can't even visit because it's such a top secret military base. Some people think that compensation is due to them. And actually, the British government did pay an initial round of compensation in the early 1980s, but it was a pretty minimal amount. So that's kind of what the Chagosians are battling for, which is separate from what the Mauritians would like.
Before we get on to what the Mauritians are after, we should say that in an unlikely twist of fate, one of the people who was banging the drum for the Chagosians through the courts here in the UK was one Keir Starmer.
Not exactly.
How does he get involved?
So I would say this was a cause for a lot of human rights lawyers of Keir Starmer's generation, many of whose kind of views were formed on Doughty Street, which was this kind of renegade chambers that was set up to kind of pursue the causes of the underdog in kind of different parts of the world and often, the victims of British colonial oppression. And what happened was that actually Philippe Sands, who is a famous human rights lawyer, he took up the case of Mauritius. So he was representing Mauritius, and the Mauritians' claim to the Chagos Islands, which is, to be fair, backed up by some Chagosians in Mauritius, although I would say there is a large number of Chagosians in the UK who are vehemently opposed to Mauritius being granted sovereignty of their homeland, and they don't want Mauritius to have it at all. But he pursued this case successfully in the end to the International Court of Justice, which issued a kind of non-binding but advisory opinion saying that when Britain separated the Chagos Islands from Mauritius as part of decolonisation, as part of awarding independence to Mauritius, that was illegal and that it ought to be part of Mauritius and that Britain should make haste to do the right thing and hand it back to Mauritius.
That's fascinating, even though it was Britain that clumped them together in the first place.
Even though it was Britain that clumped them together, yeah.
Where did Keir Starmer stand on all of this?
Since coming into government, Labour has taken an approach where it kind of pursues the rule of law. It thinks that Britain's reputation internationally was damaged, for example, by the Rwanda saga with the Conservative government.
The UK's first flight taking asylum seekers to Rwanda did not take off as scheduled on Tuesday, after an 11th-hour intervention by the European Court of Human Rights. The British government's plan had already faced a series of legal challenges.
And so it wants to be seen to be obeying the law. Actually, negotiations for handing over the Chagos Islands to Mauritius began under Liz Truss. And part of that was to do with the perception of Britain on the world stage. So if you cast your mind back to the invasion of Ukraine, Britain was trying to kind of get this global coalition to condemn Russia, condemn China, and it didn't really work. If you look at South Africa, if you look at India, if you look at, these countries have not really got off the fence and said, we utterly condemn this. And one reason is they point to Britain, for example, and say, how can you, this imperial country that still has possessions in the middle of the Indian Ocean lecture us about this.
It's very hard to tell Putin he can't have Ukraine when you still have territories in places that are controversial.
That was the argument.
So that's the sort of the complicated backdrop to Labour coming into power, wanting to obey the rule of law. Where does Keir Starmer get involved? What's his particular stance?
Starmer's one of his surprise appointments, and arguably one of the most influential people on Britain's foreign policy now, more so, I would argue, than David Lammy, the Foreign Secretary, is Lord Hermer, the Attorney General, who is the top legal officer in government. He's their top lawyer. And again, he's given speeches where he says the rule of law is paramount. We must obey international rulings. And he thinks, there's a case that, given that Britain is increasingly a middling economy, a middling power, that it has more leverage by using the soft power of being seen to uphold international law, to respect the rulings of courts, than pure military might.
So, George, what's the actual plan? What do they want to do with the Chagos Islands originally?
So the deal signed in October concerns the sovereignty of the Chagos Islands and who is the ultimate owner. And Britain originally proposed to cede sovereignty of the Chagos Islands to Mauritius, but they still wanted to keep Diego Garcia, which is where the US naval base is. So imagine it as if Britain owns a house, they give the house to a friend, but they still want to keep one room, so they still need to keep one room. And so Mauritius becomes the landlord in this example. And so Britain needs to pay Mauritius to keep Diego Garcia, and the amount of that was meant to be about £9 billion, but that's spread out over 99 years. So annual payments in total amounting to £9 billion. But then two things happened that completely changed the deal. And those both happened abroad. So one was elections in Mauritius, the other was elections in the US. So the key people that Starmer was speaking to changed. So in Mauritius, you had elections and a new government came in under a prime minister called Navin Ramgoolam. He'd actually been prime minister before. When he was elected, China said it was the return of an old friend. He's someone who's well known to them. He actually spent a lot of time in the UK. And he trashed the deal signed by the previous Mauritian government. And in a weird echo of what's happened here, he said that he'd been left a black hole by the previous Mauritian government, that there was a big financial mess. And so basically he wanted to renegotiate the deal to get more money, better terms. So that was one thing. But then simultaneously, you had elections in the US where Biden and his administration, who are broadly positive about the deal, they certainly weren't standing in the way of it. The Democrats obviously lost, Kamala Harris lost, and you got Donald Trump. And his allies have been much more critical and outspoken because of their concerns over the influence of China in Mauritius. And so that's why you ended up with another round of negotiations that is effectively still ongoing.
So they came up with a plan that would comply with the international court ruling. It would mean paying Mauritius a lot of money and handing over sovereignty. That does feel a bit like a lose-lose for Britain.
And the concern, I've spoken to people in the British Armed Forces, but particularly in America, there's a lot of concern over transferring sovereignty to Mauritius in particular. And the reason is that Mauritius has deepening economic ties with China. So the fear is that even if you sign a 99-year lease for these islands, you don't know what will happen in 10 years, you don't know what will happen in 20 years, you don't know what will happen in 30 years, and Mauritius could turn around and get a better offer from Beijing. And
there goes your military base.
And there goes your military base.
That is a complicated mess. It's also proven to be quite controversial politically in the UK. Just give us a sense of how the political spectrum has been responding.
Yeah, so obviously the Conservatives and Reform have been outspoken on this.
Why do you see fit to do a deal with a nation that has reneged on a previous deal? And why are we selling a sovereign asset of great value that we all agree for no money up front? We're paying them. It's negligent.
They've opposed it.
And in favour of a court whose judgment was advisory, he sold out the sovereignty of the British people. Truly, nobody apart from a boy called Jack has ever made a worse deal on the way to market. He's come back with a handful of beans that he's trying to sell as a prize.
We've just handed sovereign British territory to a small island nation which is an ally of China. Yes. And we are paying for the privilege. Yep. All so that the Foreign Secretary can feel good about himself at his next North London dinner party.
For the Tories, it's a bit of a problem, though, because they did start negotiations under Liz Truss. It's not entirely clear if she was being hoodwinked by officials at the time or she believed it and she's changed her mind, but suddenly she's very anti-deal. Then Boris Johnson, likewise. All Tory politicians you can think of. Nigel Farage has been banging the drum in Washington and using his contacts with the Trump administration to try and lobby to get the deal scrapped.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I've just returned hot foot from a very full Mar-a-Lago. And I've spoken to several members, senior administrators especially, of the incoming administration who will be in the White House in 32 days' time. Let me assure you, there is very deep disquiet amongst all of them as to what this may mean for the long-term future of Diego Garcia.
So there's a lot of backlash there. Within Labour, not so much at the moment.
Doing this deal on our terms was the sole way to maintain the full and effective operations of the base into the future.
But, you know, people I speak to in the armed forces who aren't allowed to speak publicly just think it's not a great idea to hand over a critical naval base in China's backyard, really, at a time of increasing competition to a country that could be more allied with China.
You said one of the things that has changed since this deal was first tabled is the new Trump administration. Do we know how they feel about it?
We know how members of the Trump administration feel. We don't know how Trump feels. So Marco Rubio, who is the Secretary of State, he's slammed the deal. He thinks it will compromise US national security. Mike Waltz, who's the new national security advisor for Trump, likewise. So you've got some pretty powerful figures there who are now in the White House who are very much opposed to it. And that's the reason why Starmer, they were actually trying to rush the deal before the inauguration of Trump so they could kind of slip it through before he notices.
Oh, really?
You know, it was almost like a game of grandmother's footsteps. They were kind of approaching it and trying to get as close to the deal as possible and hoping he wouldn't turn around and suddenly say, stop that right now. We're now at the moment where it appears they've said, stop that right now.
And if they're arguing that this is a matter of national interest for America, you know, a huge national security concern, if sovereignty is passed on to Mauritius, why did Biden sign it off?
It's a good question. I mean, it's not entirely clear whether they were best pleased with it, but they respected what an ally country wanted to do. But
yeah,
you would think in terms of US national security is not ideal for them, but the British diplomats who were working on it secured the Americans' blessing, which was a bit of a coup, to be honest.
And George, after all of that, yesterday we heard from the Mauritian Prime Minister, an unexpected intervention. What did he say?
Yeah, there was a rather long break in the Mauritian Parliament, but when all the MPs returned to their Parliament in Port Louis, the Mauritian Prime Minister had some updates for them on this kind of renegotiation process. And he obviously wanted to emphasise that he's much better at negotiating than the previous government. So he was pretty upbeat about the concessions he'd secured from Britain. And those concessions are pretty major when you look at them. So firstly, if you remember, there was a 99-year lease originally agreed for Diego Garcia. What the Mauritian Prime Minister was saying was that there was the option for a 40-year extension. So when those 99 years had finished, Britain could basically unilaterally say, we'd like another 40 years, please, of Diego Garcia, thank you very much. Now, as far as the Mauritian Prime Minister is concerned, following the renegotiations, he has managed to secure a Mauritian veto on that. So if they think that Britain has been very bad tenants of Diego Garcia, they've trashed the place, we'd like them out, they can evict the Brits after 99 years. So that's the first change. The second change is also pretty major, and that is to do with the payment. So if you remember, it was £9 billion over 99 years. Now, the Mauritian Prime Minister said that he had effectively doubled that because he had insisted that the payments were linked to inflation. So he wants it linked to inflation, and he says he's secured that concession and basically massively increased the amount of money that Britain will have to pay. He also said, so he had a call with Starmer last week, because there's been a kind of flurry of calls between London and Washington, D.C. since the Trump administration. Rubio and Lamy have spoken. Obviously, Starmer and Trump have spoken, although they didn't actually address Chagos, which is a bit surprising. But that kind of flurry of diplomacy meant that they needed to kind of update that channel between London and Port Louis as well. And so when they had that conversation, it was interesting that Starmer was echoing some of the concerns that Rubio had raised about malign influence. He talked about China and its malign influence. Now, Starmer didn't specifically talk about China as having a malign influence, but he did say in his call with Navin Rangulam that they needed to ensure that Diego Garcia was protected from malign influence. So he was kind of echoing those US concerns in that call.
Although it does sound like this is a call that didn't go so well for London. Has Downing Street said anything about the phone call? Have they responded to the Mauritian Prime Minister's comments?
So I spoke to some people in Whitehall after the Mauritian Prime Minister's intervention, and they were saying there were elements of inflation-linked payments that were always in the deal. That was their version of it, and they said that they were played down the newness of the 40-year extension and Mauritius's potential veto on that. They said there would always be some element of discussion. Perhaps Mauritius just have secured it in slightly clearer detail, but they are saying the deal is not massively changed from the one that was signed in October. They admit that payments are also being front-loaded. That was another demand of the Mauritians, basically because the new Prime Minister of Mauritius, having inherited this black hole, as he says it, would quite like the money up front to spend quickly and address that rather than in 99 years' time.
Yeah, although given that we have a black hole too, I'm not sure we'd like to hand it over up front. It does feel like Keir Starmer is really doubling down on the idea of handing back the Chagos Islands. And yet, we know that the Trump administration is obviously really concerned about this deal. They're very concerned about security and what it would mean for them. What does this mean for Trump-Starmer relations at a time when they're trying to be friends, from what we can tell? What does it mean for the special relationship if Keir Starmer does go ahead with this and Donald Trump really doesn't like it?
Look, I think Starmer's pretty delighted with how he's managed to navigate the Trump administration so far. Bear in mind we're, less than a month since the inauguration. But Trump has said very nice things about Starmer. Starmer said very nice things about Trump. They haven't really touched on the big issues. If anything, Trump has suggested that he would exclude Britain from his trade war, that he was likely not to put tariffs on Britain. So in general, the tone of relations have been surprisingly warm, given that these are two people who you wouldn't really expect to be sharing a pint together. They're pretty opposite personalities, aren't they, really? But I also think part of that is to do with the fact that it is very early days for this administration. They have other priorities. Believe it or not, Britain is not the centre of the world for the US. They are thinking about China and this trade war that they want to do and addressing what they feel is too much Chinese influence in Panama. They are dealing with the border crisis as they see it in Mexico, and then that's kind of spread over to Canada as well. Trump has volunteered his desire to take over Greenland. So there are loads of other things on his in his in tray. And this doesn't appear to be quite at the top of them. But Trump is an unpredictable guy. And perhaps tomorrow someone could slip over a memo and suddenly he pays attention to this random corner of the world that he hasn't hitherto cared about. And he suddenly decides, I'm not in favour of this at all. And you know how truculent Trump is and how easy he is to offend, and a small thing, and he could turn around and blow this up very, very quickly. So I think that Starmer is going to be happy with how things have gone so far, but you could certainly see a world in which the Chagos row could quickly go sour for him.
That was George Grylls, defence and political correspondent for The Times. Today's producer was Olivia Case. The executive producer was Kate Ford. Sound design and theme composition were by Mal Lassetto. If you enjoyed this episode, you might want to have a listen to our previous one, titled Bannon versus Musk, the battle for the soul of Donald Trump. We've put a link to it in the description of this podcast. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can drop us a line to thestory@thetimes.com. And if you can, please do leave us a review wherever you get your podcasts. We do read them all. Thanks for listening. See you tomorrow.